For centuries, Russia has been imposing its colonial view of history on the world. Today, Moscow is using imperial narratives for its war propaganda against Ukraine. 10 popular misconceptions about Ukrainian history. Number 1. Moscow is the legitimate successor of Kyivan Rus. To justify its imperial conquest of Ukraine, Russia says that Moscow is the legitimate successor of Kyivan Rus. Kyivan Rus was a powerful medieval state that emerged on the territory of modern-day Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. However, none of those nations existed as such at that time. The falsification of history dates back to the 12th century, when Andrei Bogolyubsky proclaimed himself the Grand Prince of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality. Russian historiography claims that the capital of Kyivan Rus was then moved from Kyiv to Vladimir, and then eventually to Moscow. In reality, Kyiv remained the most important city of the region until the Kyivan Rus polity was destroyed by the Mongols in the year 1240. However, Kyiv was soon rebuilt and retained its importance in the following centuries, contrary to Russian claims. Number 2. Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Moscow has repeatedly denied the existence of the Ukrainian nation. Instead, it claims that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are all a single people. From the 13th century, the developments of the peoples of present-day Ukraine and Russia followed different paths. Ukraine has been defined by its Cossack past. Zaporozhian Cossacks had their own self-government, with elections and a popular assembly. Meanwhile, Russia has continuously opted for autocracy. Through their centuries apart, Ukrainians and Russians developed distinct cultures and languages. Despite being part of the same regional subgroup, the Ukrainian and Russian languages have less lexical similarity than Spanish does with French. For centuries, Russia has been trying to wipe out the Ukrainian identity by banning its culture and language and by distorting history. In the Russian Empire, Russians even called Ukrainians Little Russians. The Soviet Union was forced to acknowledge the existence of Ukrainians, yet still portrayed them as a brotherly people, very close and impossible to picture apart. Despite decades of oppression, Ukrainians continue to cultivate their culture and finally broke free in 1991. Number 3. Crimea is Russian. To justify Russia's occupation of Crimea and subsequent invasion of Donbass in 2014, Putin has said that the peninsula is historically Russian territory. The myth goes that when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian one in 1954, it was a mere ill-advised gift. However, Crimea had zero ties to Russia before the Russian Empire annexed the peninsula in the late 18th century. The annexation forced hundreds of thousands of Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula, to flee to the Ottoman Empire. Decades of oppression against the indigenous people culminated in the Soviet regime's deportation of nearly the entire population of Crimean Tatars, as well as Armenians, Bulgarians, Greeks, and other communities, to Central Asia and Russia. Many did not survive the journey. Only in 1989 were deported Crimean Tatars allowed to return home, but their homes were already occupied by Russians who had moved into the peninsula. The vote for Ukraine's independence in the 1991 referendum and resistance against the Russian invasion in 2014 again showed that Crimea is Ukrainian. Number 4. The Holodomor famine was a result of a bad harvest. The Holodomor, the man-made famine in Ukraine, is widely recognized as a genocide against the Ukrainian people. Though Russia says it was merely the result of a bad harvest, evidence proves otherwise. Forcefully included into the Soviet Union, Ukrainians were mostly farmers with a strong sense of cultural identity and attachment to their land. That's why they actively resisted the Soviet collectivization, or collective farming, imposed by Joseph Stalin. Stalin stepped up the effort to erase Ukrainian identity in Ukrainian villages and the region of Kuban, where many Ukrainians lived. By implementing his 5-year plans, Stalin actually condemned Ukrainian peasants to death by starvation. Ukrainians were forced to provide fantastically unrealistic amounts of grain to the state, and Stalin's law of spikelets forbade them to keep any food for themselves. The Soviets confiscated not only the harvest, but any foodstuffs that could help Ukrainians survive. resistance and attempts to escape Ukraine were met with severe punishments, including execution. Receiving any help from outside was prohibited as well. Meanwhile, grain was stocked and exported abroad. The Soviet regime tried to silence any news about the massive hunger that was killing millions of Ukrainians. Number 5. Communism was a good idea with bad implementation. Some believe that communism is a great idea which has just not been properly implemented. But can it be implemented at all? Communism is impossible in practice as well as in theory. It is supposed to be established through a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the rule of the working class implies the erasure of the bourgeoisie. History has proven that any attempt to implement communism has eventually turned into abuse of power and the opposite of equality. In the Soviet Union, communism served as a cover for totalitarian rule that, according to historian Robert Conquest, killed at least 15 million people. Through terror, mass executions, deportations, and forced labor, the Soviets eventually gained the economic growth they strived for. However, the prosperity it generated only reached a narrow ruling class. But it couldn't last long. The communist ideal of a classless society was shattered by the USSR's economic mismanagement, lies, and complete disregard for human rights and freedoms. Number 6. Ukrainians are Nazis. Russia has demonized Ukrainians ever since they made a clear decision to reorient their country towards the West during the Euromaidan Revolution. Russian officials and propagandists often call Ukrainians Nazis and Banderites, referring to the supporters of 20th century nationalist Stepan Bandera. Bandera is a controversial figure in Ukraine. He was an ideologist of the national liberation movement that arose in response to the Polish rule in Western Ukraine and the subsequent terror of the Soviet regime. Eventually, Bandera became a fierce enemy of the USSR. Russian propaganda has continuously fixated on the topic of Bandera's collaboration with Germany, despite his being jailed by the Gestapo. So is Ukraine actually full of Nazis? Far-right parties are not very popular in modern Ukraine. In the last parliamentary elections, Ukraine's right-wing party gained only 2% of the vote, thus failing to pass the threshold to enter the Verkhovna Rada. Ukraine is one of the least anti-Semitic countries in Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is himself the Jewish descendant of Holocaust survivors. Number 7. Russia liberated Europe from the Nazis. Modern-day Russia uses the Soviet mythology of the so-called Great Patriotic War in an attempt to monopolize the victory in World War II. Russia, the primary successor of the Soviet Union, sees the defeat of the Nazis as its own achievement, ignoring the role of other nations. The truth is that more than 6 million Ukrainians, as well as other members of non-Russian nationalities, fought in the Red Army against Nazi Germany. Ukraine suffered some of the heaviest losses in World War II, having over half of its soldiers killed. That is more than the losses of France, the UK, and the US combined. Hence, the Soviet Union's victory would have been impossible without the contribution of all of its former nations and the effort of the anti-Hitler coalition. Number 8. Ukraine is divided east versus west. There is a common misconception about the implacable discord between Ukraine's west and east. This myth has been cultivated by Russia's decades-long influence in Ukraine. After the country gained its independence, Ukraine's pro-Russian politicians weaponized internal differences to their advantage. Ukraine is indeed a country of ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity, but so are many other nations in Europe. Against its will, Ukraine had been divided and scarred by various occupation regimes for centuries, but the narrative about a divided Ukraine has been blown far out of proportion. Russia's all-out war has proven that despite certain differences, Ukrainians are united in their belief in Ukrainian independence and nationhood. Number 9. Ukraine is a project of the West. The Kremlin insists that Ukraine is merely a political project of the West created to undermine Russia. This narrative lives off of two myths. The first one says that Ukrainians have always actually been Russian, and the concept of Ukrainian identity was made up by Polish ethnologist Jan Potocki. The other myth says that Ukrainian nationalism erupted in tiny circles of Ukrainophiles in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but was never widespread. This is how Russia has tried to convince the world that Ukrainians have never actually strived for independence. But many scholars agree that modern nations started to develop in the late 18th century. The Ukrainian national revival began shortly after. Despite centuries of oppression, Ukrainians preserved their national idea and eventually restored their independence. Number 10. Ukraine is culturally poor. Both Imperial and then Soviet Russia presented Ukrainian culture as something unsophisticated and worthy of scorn. In books, movies, and on TV, Ukrainians were often portrayed as silly peasants, dressed in primitive traditional clothes, eating sallow pork fat, and drinking. The Russian Empire and then the USSR tried to erase Ukrainian identity, from banning Ukrainian language to carrying out mass executions of Ukrainian intellectuals. Despite repressions, Ukrainian culture has managed to flourish over the centuries, resulting in an endless list of outstanding names and their works. After independence, events like the Euromaidan Revolution and the Russian invasion gave a new impetus to the development of Ukrainian culture and sparked international interest in Ukrainian traditions, music, garments, and literature.